The letter hit the floorboards of the mercantile like a gunshot. Evelyn Hawthorne did not pick it up right away. She stood over it, both hands pressed flat against the worn pine counter, her breathing shallow, and controlled the way a person breathes when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in public. The postmark read Bozeman. The handwriting on the envelope was not her brother's. Her brother was dead, and she had known it before the letter arrived. Known it the way a person knows a storm is coming before the sky changes color, by some pressure deep in the chest that has no polite name. What she had not known was the rest of it. She finally bent and picked the letter up off the floor. Around her, the town of Coldwater Creek, Montana, went about its Thursday business. A mule brayed somewhere down the main street. Glass clinked behind the saloon wall. Two women discussed a bolt of calico with the kind of deliberate cheerfulness that meant they had both seen her face go white and were pretending otherwise, because that was the mercantile code of conduct in 1882, and Evelyn had always been grateful for it until this moment, when she actually needed someone to ask her what was wrong. Nobody asked. She unfolded the letter with fingers that did not shake, because she had decided they would not shake, and she read the second paragraph again, the paragraph she had read 3 times already standing over the letter before she finally picked it up. The ranch, it said, had been used as collateral. The debt was substantial. The new creditor, a man named Harlan Voss, had purchased the note from the bank in Bozeman 2 weeks prior and intended to collect on the terms agreed upon, which were not the terms Evelyn's brother Daniel had ever mentioned to her. Not once, in any of his cheerful, shortened, carefully edited letters over the last 3 years. The terms, as written in the clear, unsympathetic hand of a bank clerk, were these: full payment of $460 within 60 days of the date of this notice, or full surrender of the deed to the property and improvements on Hawthorne Creek, including the house, the outbuildings, the water rights, and the small herd of cattle currently running on the eastern pasture. Evelyn folded the letter. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron. She thanked Mrs. Garrett for the thread she had come in to buy and walked out of the mercantile into the September heat of Coldwater Creek. $460. She had 41 in the tin box under the floorboard of the bedroom. She had the cattle, which were not worth $460 at current prices, even if she drove them herself to Miles City, and sold every last one at top dollar. She had the house her father had built with his own hands, the one her mother had died in, the one she had come back to after Daniel's wife passed from fever, and Daniel needed help with the girls, the one she had been running alone for 14 months while Daniel's health declined, and then collapsed entirely into a grave at the edge of the eastern pasture, where Evelyn had buried him herself with the help of old Toby Marsh, who was the only neighbor within 5 miles and was 73 years old. She stood in the street with the September sun pressing down on the crown of her hat and thought, very clearly and without any particular drama, that she was in serious trouble. Then she thought about the high pass. She had not thought about Charles Talbot in a long time. Or rather, she had thought about him in the way you think about something that is finished, the way you check a wound that has closed over and assure yourself it is healed, which is not the same as not thinking about it at all. She had thought about him the way you think about a door you have permanently locked from the inside, aware of it, not opening it, keeping your back to it with the practiced ease of someone who has been keeping their back to it for 5 years. 5 years. He had gone up to the high pass in the autumn of 1877, and he had not come down. She had not asked him to go. She had not told him to stay. What had happened between them in that single summer, the summer before she left for her teaching position in Helena, and he was still Charles Talbot of Coldwater Creek, and not yet the legend that people had made of him. That thing was not something she had ever adequately named, and its lack of name had made it possible for both of them to leave it behind without official ceremony. She had left first. He had gone up to the high pass that winter and never come back down. Evelyn walked to her horse, untied him from the post, and stood with her hand on the saddle for a long moment looking north, where the Beartooth Range cut the blue September sky in a clean, cold line above the tree line. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and rode home. The cattle needed feeding. The fence on the north quarter had been down for a week. The creek had silted up along the lower reach, and she needed to clear it before the dry season set in, or the winter water situation would be worse than last year. There was preserving to be done, wood to be split, a roof shingle that had worked itself loose and would not survive the first snow. She had 60 days. She had $41. She had a head full of pride that had never once done her a single practical good. She did not ride north that day. She did the chores. She made dinner for herself alone and ate it at the table where 4 people had once eaten together, and where she now ate with a book propped against the salt shaker, so she had something to look at besides the empty chairs. She did not sleep well. She did not sleep well the next night either. On the third night she lay awake listening to the coyotes work the creek bottom and thought about hidden debts and dark pasts, and the particular kind of betrayal that comes from someone you loved keeping secrets from you because they thought they were protecting you, when really they were only delaying the catastrophe and ensuring that you would face it alone. Daniel had never told her about the loan. He had carried that secret the way he carried everything uncomfortable, turned inward, compressed, invisible until it was not. She thought about Harlan Voss, whose name she knew the way you know the name of a weather system that is building over the mountains. He had bought land along the creek in the spring. He had a crew of 8 men who were hard-looking and did not smile at the women in the street. He had made 2 other families leave their property in the last year, one by legal means and one by means that were never proven in court, but that everyone in Coldwater Creek understood perfectly well. She thought about her $41 and her empty house and her locked door. Then she thought about Charles Talbot again, not the locked-away version. The real one, the one she had filed away in the part of her memory that was not for daily use, the one that was still walking around the edges of that summer 5 years ago with its boots on, and its dark eyes tracking her across every room they had ever shared. She got up before dawn. She wrote a letter. She sent it with Toby Marsh's grandson, who rode to town twice a week, and she told him to ask at the general store if anyone knew how to get a message to the trapper who kept a cabin somewhere above the high pass on the eastern slope, the one they called Talbot. She did not sleep better after she sent the letter. But she stopped lying awake all night, which was progress of a kind. 3 weeks passed. The fence got fixed. The creek got cleared. 8 of the cattle were sold at a loss to a buyer passing through, which brought her to $93 and a reduced herd that would be harder to maintain through the winter. Harlan Voss sent a man to ride along the edge of her property twice in 1 week, not crossing the line, just riding, just being seen, which was the sort of thing Harlan Voss did and which was not technically illegal, and which Evelyn refused to show any outward sign of noticing. She noticed it plenty on the inside. She repaired the shingle. She canned 32 jars of tomatoes. She mended the winter's worth of darning she had been putting off. She taught herself not to look north at the pass every time she stepped outside, which took most of the 3 weeks and was never entirely successful. The reply came on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after she sent her letter. It was not a letter. It was half a piece of brown paper, folded once, with 4 words written on it in handwriting she recognized instantly with a lurch in her chest that she chose to interpret as surprise. The 4 words were, "I will be there." No date, no signature, no punctuation. Just those 4 words in that handwriting that was almost too neat for a man who lived alone in the mountains, that had always been a little at odds with the roughness of everything else about him. Evelyn read the note 4 times. Then she put it under the floorboard with the tin box, because she had no other good reason to explain why she didn't put it in the stove with the rest of the paper scraps. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she had contacted him because he was the most capable man she had ever met, and because her options were limited, and because he had a history with this land, and might be willing to help for reasons that had nothing to do with the two of them and everything to do with geography and circumstance. And the fact that he was the only person she could think of who would not require 3 weeks of convincing before he agreed to ride out against Harlan Voss. She told herself all of this with great conviction and reasonable success. She was splitting wood on the morning of the 23rd day after she sent the note when she heard a horse on the road above the creek. She did not stop splitting. She drove them all through a round of pine with more force than was strictly necessary and let the two halves fall where they would and set the next round on the block and drove them all through that one too. The horse stopped. She heard it blow a breath. She heard a saddle creak. She picked up another round of pine and set it on the block. Evelyn. His voice was lower than she remembered. Or perhaps she had been remembering it wrong all this time, softening it the way memory softens things it cannot afford to keep sharp. It was not a soft voice. It was the kind of voice that a person used when they had spent 5 years talking mostly to themselves and to horses and to the particular silence of a high mountain winter, a voice that had gotten economical with effort and was now incapable of wasting itself. She put them all down. She turned around. Charles Talbot looked like 5 years in the mountains. He was bigger through the shoulders than he had been, or perhaps the coat made him look that way, a long dark coat that had been good quality once and was now good function. His beard was kept but full. He had lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there before. He sat his horse with the absolute stillness of a man who had spent years alone in places where moving carelessly meant consequences, and he was looking at her with those dark eyes that had always given too much away. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back. "You look tired," he said. "You look like a man who lives in a mountain," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It might have been the beginning of a smile, or it might have been the wind. "Your note said you had trouble," he said. "My note said I needed help," she said, "which is a different thing." He swung down from the horse. He was taller than she remembered, which was not possible, and was therefore some trick of the 5 years and the coat and the changed quality of him, and he walked toward her with the same unhurried, ground-eating stride she remembered, and he stopped at a sensible distance and looked at her in that direct way he had always had, the way that had always made her feel that whatever dishonesty she was attempting was visible to him from across a room. "What kind of help?" he said. She told him. All of it. She had planned to be concise and measured and businesslike, but the story had accumulated details in 60 days the way creeks accumulate debris in a flood, and by the time she had finished telling him about Daniel's death and the secret loan and Harlan Voss and the 60-day notice and the $93 she now had in the tin box, she had been talking for 20 minutes, and her throat was tight in a way she found deeply inconvenient. Charles had not interrupted her once. He stood with his hat in his hand and listened to every word, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Voss," he said, "you know him. I know of him." He turned his hat once in his hands. "He's been buying up water rights along this whole side of the range. He's not interested in cattle, he's interested in the creek." "My water rights go with the deed," Evelyn said. "I know. Then you understand why I can't simply sell and move on." "I understood that before you said it." He looked at her for a moment. "You have 60 days from the date of the notice. When did it arrive?" 3 weeks before I sent the note. The note took nearly 3 weeks to reach you. "So you have roughly 2 weeks left," he said. Evelyn had been telling herself this was not as bad as it sounded for most of the last 3 weeks. Hearing it stated plainly by someone else made it land differently, made it real in a way that her own internal estimates had not quite managed. "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on. He looked at the house, then at the barn, then at the stretch of creek visible through the willows, then back at her. "All right," he said. "All right meaning what?" She said, because she had learned long ago that with Charles Talbot, clarity was worth asking for even when the statement seemed obvious, because he had a tendency to consider things settled before he had said a tenth of what needed to be said. "Meaning I'll help you," he said. Meaning I'm not going back up that pass until this is resolved. She studied him. He met her gaze without flinching, without explanation, without any of the things a person usually adds when they are making a significant offer and want credit for the significance of it. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. "You asked," he said finally. That was not the whole answer. She knew it. He knew she knew it. Neither of them said anything further on the subject. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "There's a good loft." "I've slept worse." "I imagine you have." She led him to the barn. She showed him where the hay was, where the water bucket was, where the tack hung. He moved through the space with an easy familiarity that reminded her that he had spent time in this barn 5 years ago, that he had helped Daniel with a calf one February night that had gone badly, that he knew this property the way you know a place you have had occasion to care about. She left him to settle his horse and went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window and watched the barn door for approximately 2 minutes before she caught herself doing it and went to put the kettle on instead. That evening he came to the door at supper time, as she had told him he should, and they ate together at the table where she now did not need the book against the salt shaker, which she noticed and chose not to examine. He told her, over salt pork and boiled potatoes and coffee that was better than anything he had drunk in 5 years by his own admission, what he knew about Harlan Voss. It was not comfortable information. Voss had arrived in the territory 4 years ago with money that came from somewhere unspecified, and a talent for locating properties that were vulnerable in ways that were not immediately apparent. Families with hidden debts or disputed titles or aging owners without clear heirs. He had a lawyer in Miles City and another in Bozeman, and what he did was technically legal, mostly, which made him more dangerous than a man who operated outside the law because the law could not easily be turned against him. "What he wants," Charles said, setting down his coffee cup, "is control of the creek water for at least 3 miles through this valley. If he gets this property, he controls the water upstream and can effectively determine who farms and who doesn't on this side of the range." "Which is why the Hendersons left," Evelyn said. "The Hendersons were downstream. He cut off their irrigation twice in a dry summer. They couldn't prove it was intentional." He paused. "The Caldwells had a title irregularity from the original survey. Small thing, fixable, but it cost money to fix and Voss bought the note before they could." "And me," Evelyn said. "Daniel's loan." "Yes." He looked at his plate for a moment. "Your brother was sick for a long time. He needed money for the doctor in Bozeman. He didn't want to worry you." She had worked this out already. Knowing it and hearing it said were, again, different things. She pressed her fork into a potato with more precision than necessary. "He should have told me," she said. "Yes," Charles said, "he should have." No argument, no softening, no careful qualification. She had expected one of the three and he had offered none. She looked up at him and he looked back at her with that infuriating directness. "What do we do?" she said. "First, we need to know exactly what the loan document says. The terms, the conditions, all of it. Not the summary in the notice, the actual document. The bank in Bozeman has it. I'll go to Bozeman. That's 3 days each way. Which leaves us 9 days when I get back. Tight but workable." He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. "There's a man in Bozeman, a lawyer named Alderman. He's honest, which is rare enough to be worth mentioning. If there's any irregularity in the loan document, anything that gives you grounds to challenge the terms, he'll find it. Lawyers cost money." "Alderman and I have a different arrangement," Charles said, in the tone of someone who was not going to explain the arrangement in detail. She studied him. "What did you do for him?" "Found his son." He paused. "The boy went missing in the mountains 2 winters ago. I found him." She thought about that for a moment. About a man who lived alone on a mountain pass and found lost boys in the winter and apparently did not charge for such things but filed them away as credit against future needs. "All right," she said, "but I want to see the document. Everything you learn, you tell me, every word. I wasn't going to do otherwise. I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her. "I know you are." She cleared the table. He dried the dishes, which she had not asked him to do, and which he did with the same unhurried efficiency he applied to everything. She watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about hidden motives and what exactly a man who had lived in the mountains alone for 5 years wanted with this situation, and then thought about the fact that she had been the one to send for him, and therefore the hidden motive question was at least as applicable to herself. She had sent for him because he was capable and because she was desperate. Both things were true. She had also sent for him because no other name had come to her mind when she tried to think of someone who would come, and the fact that his had come so quickly and so certainly was information about herself that she was not currently prepared to interpret. He left for Bozeman before dawn the next morning. She woke to hear his horse on the road and lay in the dark listening to the hoofbeats diminish up the valley, and then turned over and went back to sleep with considerably more ease than she had managed in weeks, which was also information she chose not to examine. He was gone for 6 days, not the 6 he had estimated but the 6 the distance actually required, and in those 6 days Evelyn did not stop working. She rode the fence line twice. She completed the winter inventory. She visited old Toby Marsh, who was the closest thing to a neighbor she had, and who knew everyone in the valley and the history of every piece of property in it, and she asked him what he knew about the original Hawthorne land claim, and whether he had ever heard of any dispute in the title. Toby knew a great deal. He always had. He sat on his porch in the autumn sun and chewed tobacco, and told her things about this valley that went back to her father's arrival in 1861, things about the original survey and the creek boundaries, and an old argument between her father and the man who had owned the parcel to the east, a man who had eventually sold and moved to Oregon, and whose claim had eventually passed through 3 hands, and was now part of what Harlan Voss was accumulating. "Your father's deed is solid," Toby said. "I was there when the original filing was done. Sam Hawthorne was careful. Daniel may have used it as collateral improperly," Evelyn said. "I don't know the terms of the loan." "Dan never was as careful as your father." Toby said it without cruelty, with the flat resignation of someone who had watched Daniel Hawthorne his whole life and had developed accurate opinions. "Heard you sent for Talbot." "Word travels," Evelyn said, "at the speed of every loose mouth between here and the high pass." He spat off the porch. "Good choice. If you had to send for someone, Talbot's the right one. He's helping with the legal situation." "I'm sure he is." Toby did not say anything further on the subject, which was worse than if he had. She rode home in the long afternoon light and told herself that she and Charles had a practical arrangement, and that practical arrangements were the only kind she was capable of at this particular time in her life, and she believed herself well enough to last until she got the horses fed and dinner cooked. And then she sat at the table alone and thought about the way he had dried those dishes without being asked, and she gave up trying to believe herself about anything for the evening. Charles came back on the 6th day, late afternoon, riding harder than she would have expected given the distance he had already covered. She was in the garden pulling the last of the winter squash when she heard him, and she had straightened and turned before she realized she was doing it. He came through the gate and dismounted in one motion and came toward her with something in his expression that she could not immediately read, which was unusual because she had always been able to read him, or had thought she could, which was perhaps not the same thing. "What did you find?" she said. "Plenty," he said. "Some of it good, some of it not." He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Let me see to the horse and I'll tell you all of it." She waited for him in the kitchen. She put water on and sat at the table with her hands folded, and the specific patience of a person who has learned that waiting without visible anxiety is the most useful skill you can develop when your entire life is suspended in someone else's report. He came in 20 minutes later. He sat across from her. He put a folded set of papers on the table between them. "This is Alderman's assessment," he said, "and a copy of the loan document." She reached for the papers. He let her take them. She read through the assessment first, because she had learned that you always read the interpretation before the raw material when the raw material might be too dense for speed. Alderman's handwriting was small and precise. He had found two things. The first was procedural. The loan had been transferred to Harlan Voss from the Bozeman Bank without the notification required by Montana territorial law, which did not nullify the debt but did give grounds to challenge the validity of Voss's right to collect on it directly, at least until proper notification procedure was completed. The second thing was structural. The collateral agreement in the loan document used language that referred to the property deed in a way that was ambiguous, specifically regarding the water rights, which were listed in a separate section of the original Hawthorne deed, and which Alderman argued, with considerable legal precision, were not actually captured by the collateral agreement as written, meaning that even in the event of default, the water rights might not legally transfer. Evelyn read this twice. Then she read the relevant section of the loan document. Then she looked up at Charles. "Voss doesn't know about this," she said. "Alderman believes not. His lawyer in Bozeman isn't as sharp as he thinks." Charles had both hands flat on the table watching her work through it. If the water rights aren't captured by the collateral, then even if you lose the land, he doesn't get what he's actually after. But I would still lose the land. Yes, she looked at the papers. What about the procedural issue? How long does that buy us? Alderman says 30 to 60 days if challenged properly. Maybe more if Voss's lawyer is as slow as he expects. That's time to raise money. Or to negotiate from a position where Voss knows he can't get the water rights regardless. She thought about this. She was good at this kind of thinking, had always been, the kind that moved quickly through a problem looking for the load-bearing point. Daniel had called it her lawyer's brain, which was meant as a compliment and had arrived that way. "He wants the water," she said. "If he can't get the water, the land is worth significantly less to him. He's been paying these acquisition prices because the water rights are what justify the cost. That's what Alderman thinks. Then we need to tell him. Not threaten, not confront, just make it known that we know about the water rights ambiguity. See if he'd rather deal at a reasonable price than spend money on a legal fight he might not win." Charles was quiet for a moment. "That's a better approach than I was thinking." "What were you thinking?" "Considerably less diplomatic," he said, and there was something dry enough in it to be almost humor. She almost smiled. She stopped herself, mostly out of habit. "Can Alderman draft a letter to Voss's lawyer explaining the water rights issue?" "He can. He will. I asked him to be ready." "Then send word. Tell him to draft it." She put the papers down on the table. She looked at him across the length of it. The evening light was coming through the west window, and it hit the side of his face and made him look younger than he was, or perhaps it made him look like the person she remembered rather than the mountain version of him, and she had the sudden distinct impression that the two were less different than she had been telling herself. "Charles," she said. "Yes. Thank you for going, for all of it." He looked at her with those dark eyes that gave too much away. "You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to." He was quiet for a moment. "You always did things that way," he said, "on purpose, with intention." She didn't know what to do with that. She picked up the coffee pot instead and poured them both a cup and changed the subject to the practical questions of what came next, and he followed her lead with the same ease he followed everything. And they sat and talked through the plan for another hour until the candle was getting low, and the night was fully dark outside. Harlan Voss's response to Alderman's letter came 8 days later, which was remarkably fast, and told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how seriously the water rights issue had landed. The response was not an offer. It was a meeting request, which was better than an offer in some ways because it meant Voss was negotiating rather than litigating. Charles read the letter over her shoulder, which required him to stand close enough that she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold for a very long time, as something that requires careful management of distance. "He wants to meet at his office in town," she said. "Neutral ground would be better. The Mercantile has a back room. Mrs. Garrett lets it for meetings." "Better." He stepped back, which helped. "You should have Alderman present, or at least have written authority from him." "I'll write to him today." She turned, and he was still closer than she had fully registered, and she stopped with about 18 inches between them and looked up at him. "I'm going to handle the negotiation myself." He did not look surprised. He did not look as if he felt challenged. He looked, if anything, like someone confirming information he had already assumed. "I know," he said. "You can be there, but I'll speak." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and the complete sincerity of it was harder to deal with than skepticism would have been. She stepped around him. She went to find paper. The meeting with Harlan Voss happened on a Tuesday in October, in the back room of Garrett's Mercantile, with Mrs. Garrett providing coffee that nobody drank, and then leaving with the transparent pretense of having business elsewhere while keeping the door slightly ajar, which Evelyn appreciated as a form of frontier security. Harlan Voss was not what she had imagined, or rather he was what she had imagined in the sense that she had imagined something slick and well-dressed and plausible-looking, and he was all of those things. He was about 50, with silver at his temples and a suit that had been made somewhere with more tailoring options than Coldwater Creek, and he had the particular pleasant manner of a man who was accustomed to being underestimated by people who confused civility for weakness. He did not underestimate Evelyn. She could see him adjusting in the first 30 seconds, the way a man adjusts when he walks into a room expecting to find a distressed widow and finds instead a woman who knows exactly what her water rights are worth. She laid out the situation calmly and without drama. The procedural challenge to the debt transfer, Alderman's analysis of the water rights language, the estimated cost of litigation versus negotiation. The fact that she had no particular attachment to winning a legal fight and every interest in reaching a practical resolution. Voss listened. His own man, a younger fellow who appeared to be both assistant and lawyer in some combination, made notes. Charles sat to her left and slightly behind her, utterly still, saying nothing, being in the room in the particular way that a very capable man is in a room when he is choosing not to be threatening, but is making no effort to conceal what he is. Voss glanced at Charles twice during her presentation. Both times Charles looked back at him with absolutely nothing in his expression. Both times Voss looked away first. The outcome of the meeting was not the best possible outcome and was not the worst. Voss agreed to accept payment of $300 in full settlement of the debt, releasing the deed and all associated rights including the water. He had originally held a $460 note. The reduction was meaningful. It was not, by any realistic measure, within Evelyn's reach even with the $93 in the tin box, but it was manageable. She knew it was manageable because she had a plan she had not yet told Charles about, because she had been waiting to see what the negotiation produced before she decided whether the plan was necessary. She shook Voss's hand. She did not smile. He did with the professional ease of a man closing a transaction that had not gone entirely his way but had gone well enough. He left. His assistant left. Mrs. Garrett's door swung open the rest of the way. Evelyn sat in the back room of the Mercantile and let out a breath that had been held for approximately 60 days. Charles sat beside her, no longer slightly behind, and said, "300. Yes. You have 93. I have a plan," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me." She told him. The cattle, the remaining ones, she had already identified a buyer in Miles City who would pay fair prices if the drive happened before the winter set in. The drive was a week out and a week back. The prices would bring her to roughly $160, $170 if she drove them herself and didn't pay for a drover, which was still not $300. "But my aunt in Helena has a standing offer to lend me money," she said. "She made it when Daniel died. I was too proud to take it. I'm not too proud now." "How much will she lend?" "Enough. She's comfortable. She had a practical marriage and invested wisely." Evelyn turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I should have written to her 2 months ago. It would have been less complicated." "But you didn't," Charles said. "No," she said. "I thought I could manage it alone." "Could you have?" he said, not challenging. Genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. No, she said, probably not. I might have found the money. I wouldn't have known about the water rights. I would have paid $460 and Voss would have gotten exactly what he was after regardless. Charles nodded. He was quiet for a moment. The cattle drive, he said. You said you drive them yourself. I've done it before, not alone. I've done it with 2 people before. I can manage the number of head I have. I'll come with you. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said, using her own words from the thank you conversation with that complete lack of self-consciousness that she was finding increasingly difficult to maintain her position against. She thought about a week's drive to Miles City with Charles Talbot. She thought about the evenings on the trail, the mornings, the particular enforced intimacy of driving cattle with one other person across open country in October. She thought about the locked door. All right, she said. They left 3 days later, just before dawn, with 31 head of mixed cattle and 2 horses, and enough provisions for the trail. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning in Montana that is beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are also slightly threatening, the mountains showing their first hard caps of snow, and the grass brittle with frost. Charles rode on the right flank. Evelyn rode point, which was where she preferred to be, where she could see what was ahead, and the cattle spread out naturally behind her in the pattern they preferred when they were being moved without stress. She had learned cattle years ago, first from her father and then from Daniel, and she handled them with the quiet competence of someone who knows that cattle are creatures of habit and that the job of the driver is mostly to be predictable. They did not talk much that first morning, which was fine. You didn't need to talk when you were working. The work was its own conversation, the small signals and adjustments, the way he moved his horse to catch a steer that was drifting left without her having to say anything, the way she adjusted the pace when she saw him reading the western sky in the way that meant weather. At noon they stopped by a creek and let the cattle drink and ate their own lunch in the particular companionable silence of people who are doing hard work together and have arrived at a mutual understanding of each other's usefulness. You're good at this, he said, in the tone of someone stating an observed fact rather than offering a compliment. I grew up with it. You left, he said. The teaching position. Most people who leave don't come back knowing how to work a herd. I came back for Daniel, she said. I relearned the work because the work needed doing. He considered this. And before you came back, did you like teaching? It was a straightforward question. It caught her slightly sideways because he was not a person who usually asked about preferences, not directly. I did, she said. I liked it very much. I was good at it. I know you were. You weren't there. People talked. He had a way of looking at the horizon when he said things that made them easier and harder to deal with simultaneously. You left quickly. They talked about that too. What did they say? He glanced at her. Different things, depending on who you asked. What did you say? She hadn't intended to ask that. It came out of its own accord from somewhere she had intended to keep quiet. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to deflect. I said you'd done what you thought was right, he said, and that I expected you'd succeed at whatever you put your mind to because you always had. She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle with an expression of professional attention that she did not fully believe. That was generous, she said. It was true, he said. Generous would have been something I didn't believe. She turned back to the trail. They rode in silence for another mile. Then she said, because the silence had the quality of something waiting rather than something finished, I left because I'd been offered the position twice and turned it down both times, and I thought if I turned it down a third time I'd be turning it down for reasons I wasn't ready to be honest about. He said nothing. And I wasn't ready, she said. I was 23 and I wasn't ready to be honest about what those reasons were, and by the time I might have been, it seemed very late. 5 years is a long time, he said. Yes. I went up the pass because I'd been running the trapline for Collins and it wasn't working anymore and I needed something different, he said, with the careful, measured quality of someone telling a real reason after years of accepting a practical explanation. That's the part I told people, the practical part. She waited. The other part, he said, was that this particular valley had become difficult to be in. She looked at him. He was still looking at the trail ahead. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry," he said. "I'm not sorry. I learned things I wouldn't have learned anywhere else. I needed what was up there." He paused. "But I also needed to come down eventually." "Is that why you answered my note?" she said. He turned and looked at her fully, not at the horizon, not at the trail, directly at her, and his expression was the one she had been avoiding naming for approximately 30 days now, the one that was not practical or professional or arrangement-oriented. "Part of it," he said. She looked back at the trail. Her heart was doing something that had nothing to do with the altitude or the exertion. "Charles." "Yes." "I think we should probably deal with the cattle and the deed and all of the practical circumstances before we discuss the other things." He turned back to the trail. "Agreed." "After," she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it. He didn't say anything, but she saw the corner of his mouth, and this time it was definitely a smile. Miles City in October was cold and busy and smelled of cattle and wood smoke, and the particular productive chaos of a territory that was still figuring out what it intended to be. They drove the cattle into the stockyard on the afternoon of the 6th day, which was a day later than she had planned because they had gone around a section of trail that had washed out in recent rain rather than pushing the cattle through uncertain footing, which had been Charles's suggestion and which had been the right call. The buyer, a man named Pritchett, was already there waiting, which said something complimentary about his organizational abilities and something slightly concerning about his eagerness. But Evelyn was a fair negotiator, and Pritchett was a fair buyer, and they arrived at a price that was within 15 cents ahead of what she had projected, which was close enough to make the math work. $168 and some cents, added to the 93 in the tin box. Added to the letter she had written to her aunt in Helena from Coldwater Creek before they left, which she had sent with Toby Marsh's grandson with explicit instructions, and which would have arrived by now, the reply of which she expected to find waiting when they returned. She deposited the cattle money at the Miles City branch bank and felt, for the first time in 60-plus days, something that resembled solid ground. They stayed in Miles City one night. She at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Pryor, who was efficient and clean and charged reasonable rates. Charles at the same establishment, which had separate wings and Mrs. Pryor, who managed her operation with the same standards she applied to everything. That evening he found her in the common room after dinner where she was writing in the small journal she kept for accounts and plans, and he sat across from her with 2 cups of coffee that he had obtained from somewhere and set one in front of her without comment. She closed the journal. She picked up the coffee. "It's going to work," she said. "I know," he said. "You can't know. The letter to my aunt might not have been answered. Your aunt is a practical woman who loves you and has money to spare and made you an offer she meant. The letter was answered." He said it with a certainty that was not arrogance, was instead the specific confidence of a man who has learned to read situations accurately and does not hedge his assessments to seem humble. She thought about arguing. "Yes," she said instead. "I think it probably was." They drank their coffee. The fire in the common room had gotten low, and the lamp on her table was the brightest light in the room, and it made everything feel closer and warmer than the October night outside. "After we get back," she said. "And the deed is settled. What do you plan to do?" He looked at his coffee cup. "I hadn't made specific plans. Do you want to go back up the pass?" She asked it as simply as she could manage, which took some effort. He was quiet for a long time. "No," he said. "I don't think I do." "What do you want?" she said, and her voice had gotten quieter than she intended, which was information. He looked up from the coffee cup and at her, and the lamplight was on his face, and he had that expression again, the one she had been not naming for 30 days, and she decided the practical circumstances had been adequately addressed for the moment. "I want to stay in this valley," he said. "I want to do work that matters. He stopped. He started again. "I want what I've been thinking about for 5 years without letting myself think about it directly." "That sounds uncomfortable," she said. "It was," he said. "What were you thinking about?" she said, and she was not certain her voice was entirely steady, and she found she didn't care very much. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers on the journal. His hand was large and rough and very warm, and he held hers without pressure, just contact, just the simple fact of it. "You," he said. "I was thinking about you." The fire cracked. The lamp burned. Outside, Miles City went about its evening business with no particular awareness of what was happening in Mrs. Pryor's common room. Evelyn turned her hand over under his so their palms were together and their fingers interlaced, and she said, "I kept your note, the 4 words. I put it under the floorboard with the money tin." He looked at their hands. "I wrote 6 drafts," he said. "I couldn't figure out what to say. 4 words was the right number. I thought anything more would be too much and anything less wouldn't be enough." A pause. "I'm better at being here than at writing." "I noticed," she said. She looked at him across the small table in the firelight. This man, who had come down from the high pass for the first time in 5 years, who had ridden to Bozeman and sat through a meeting with Harlan Voss and driven cattle to Miles City, and who was holding her hand with the careful honesty of someone who had not had much practice at this particular kind of honesty, and was doing it anyway. She thought about 5 years and locked doors and the way a wound closes over, and a person mistakes the closing for healing, and goes on for a long time before realizing the two are not the same. "Charles," she said. "Yes. I need to tell you something I should have said in the summer of 1877. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said for the 3rd time, and this time he almost laughed. "Then tell me," he said. "I left because I was frightened," she said. "Not of you, of what being with you would have meant for me, what I would have had to give up or rearrange or be honest about wanting. I was 23 and ambitious and afraid of wanting something that would require me to stay in one place." He listened without interrupting. "And I was wrong," she said. "Not about the ambition, but about the fear. It was a coward's reason, and I dressed it up as a practical one, and I've been living with the practical story for 5 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could have said something before you left. I had opportunities. I didn't take them." "Why not?" "Because I was afraid you'd say no, and that would have been definitive," he said. "And as long as I didn't ask, there was no definitive answer, which was its own kind of cowardice." She looked at him. "We wasted 5 years," she said. "We did," he said. "I'd rather not waste any more." She stood up from her chair, and she walked around the small table, and he turned to face her and stood too, and she was close enough to him that she had to look up to see his face, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, the most unguarded, the most without the careful calibration of a man who had learned to keep things protected. She put her free hand against his jaw, which was rough with several days of trail, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and turned his face very slightly toward her hand the way something turns toward warmth without deciding to. And when he opened his eyes, they were very close and very dark, and she kissed him. It was the kind of first kiss that had 5 years of not being kissed in it, which made it thorough and serious and not brief. And when it ended, she had both hands on his face and he had both arms around her, and the common room of Mrs. Pryor's establishment was very quiet around them. He pressed his forehead against hers. She could feel him breathing. 5 years, he said. "Stop counting," she said, which was not what she meant, and he seemed to understand that because he kissed her again. They rode back to Coldwater Creek over the next week, with a lightness between them that was the specific kind that comes from something that has been put away for too long finally being taken out and held in the open air. They talked. They talked more in that week of riding than she suspected either of them had talked in years. About everything. About the mountains and what he had learned in them. About Helena and the teaching and the girls she had taught who had grown up with nothing and deserved everything. About her father and his father, and the particular mythology of men who build things in hard country. About what the valley might look like if the water rights remained in the hands of people who understood what they were for. He made her laugh 3 times on the second day, which was a number she had not achieved with any single person in recent memory, and each time it happened he looked at her with an expression that was quiet and pleased and very private, as if her laughing was something he was cataloging. She found out, because she asked him directly, that he was 31, which she had half known and was reassured to hear confirmed. He found out that she was 28, which he already knew, he said, because he had always known, and some things you don't forget. You remembered my age for 5 years while living on a mountain, she said. I remembered quite a lot, he said, with a complete lack of embarrassment that she found both impressive and slightly unfair. They arrived back in Coldwater Creek on a Friday afternoon. The valley looked the way it always looked in October, severe and golden, the aspens in their last color, the mountains fully white above the tree line. Evelyn looked at the house and the barn and the creek and felt, perhaps for the first time since Daniel died, that it was hers in the way she wanted it to be, not a burden she was managing alone, not a place she was defending out of duty, but a place she actually wanted to be. The letter from her aunt had arrived. Toby Marsh's grandson had left it in the barn as instructed, along with a note from Toby that said, with his characteristic economy of words, that everything had been quiet and that he hoped the drive had gone well. Her aunt had enclosed $150 and a letter that was 2 pages of the kind of honest, practical affection that Evelyn's aunt had always specialized in. She had also enclosed a shorter note that said with perfect accuracy that she was very glad Evelyn had finally asked. $218, 93 in the tin box, 168 from the cattle, 150 from her aunt, minus the 12 she had spent on the drive. That was $419. She needed $300 for Voss. She needed $25 for Alderman's fee for the letter and the legal work. She would have more than enough, with a remainder that would take the winter. She sat at the table and did the arithmetic 3 times to make sure it was right, and it was right all 3 times, and she sat back and let out a breath that she felt in her entire body. Charles was at the kitchen door. He had been seeing to the horses and had come back to find her sitting at the table with numbers written on a piece of paper and an expression on her face that he apparently read correctly. "It works," he said. "It works," she said. He sat down across from her, not at his careful professional distance but close at the actual table, close enough that their hands were near each other on the surface. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. His expression was careful in the specific way of someone who has prepared what they intend to say and is now deciding whether the preparation was adequate. "Ask," she said. "I have money," he said. "Not a great deal. But several years of trapping income that's been sitting in the bank in Bozeman, because there's nothing to spend money on when you live on a mountain. Enough to be useful." She understood immediately where this was going and felt a reflexive tightening of her practical independence, which she recognized as one of her less useful characteristics and made an effort to set aside. "What are you proposing?" she said carefully. "I'm not proposing a loan," he said, equally carefully. "I'm proposing something with more permanence." He looked at her with those direct eyes that had never, not once, pretended to feel less than they felt. "I know this is fast, by some measures. By other measures it's 5 years overdue." "Charles," she said, "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me," he said, "not because of the money or the deed or any practical reason. Because I've been in love with you since that summer 5 years ago, and I've had 5 years on a mountain to become very clear about it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October wind was moving through the willows along the creek. The afternoon light was doing its particular October thing, golden and horizontal and very brief. She looked at him. She thought about 23 years old and a teaching position and a locked door. She thought about 30 days of him being here, fixing fences and riding to Bozeman and drying dishes, and holding her hand across a table in Miles City. She thought about the note under the floorboard, the 4 words in that neat handwriting. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he repeated as if checking it. "That was a clear and definitive answer," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb moved across her knuckles. "I should do this properly," he said. "I don't have a ring." "I don't need a ring today," she said. Today I need a cup of coffee and someone to help me write a bank draft." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh, fully, without the careful half measure of the almost smiles, and it transformed his face into something warm and unguarded and entirely itself. And she thought that she could very easily spend the rest of her life hearing that sound. The payment to Harlan Voss was made on a Monday morning in early November, in the form of a bank draft delivered by Alderman's clerk to Voss's office, with the proper legal documentation of full settlement and release of the deed. Voss signed without visible emotion, which was the correct level of emotion for a man who had not gotten what he actually wanted and was pragmatic enough to recognize a closed door. Alderman sent word that the deed was clear and the water rights unambiguous and the matter fully resolved. Evelyn held the deed in her kitchen and looked at it for a long time. Her father's name was on it, neat and permanent, and below it in the recent transfer notation her own name, Evelyn Margaret Hawthorne, and the creek and the pastures and the house and all of it, hers, settled, clear. She put it back in the box with the tin and the forward note, which was still there. She was married to Charles Talbot the following spring, in May of 1883, in the small church at Coldwater Creek, which was a simple building that served the valley's scattered residents on alternating Sundays and which was, on this particular Saturday, holding the largest gathering it had hosted since the founding of the congregation. This was apparently due to the combined effect of Mrs. Garrett's organizational enthusiasm and the fact that Coldwater Creek had very little in the way of entertainment, and a wedding was the most interesting thing to happen in the valley since the previous winter's floods. Toby Marsh was there, looking uncomfortable in a suit jacket that had last been worn at some point considerably before his current age. He shook Charles's hand for a long time without saying anything and then said, "Good," which was, from Toby, an extravagant expression of approval. Evelyn's aunt came from Helena, which was a journey she made with her customary efficiency, and which resulted in her arriving 2 days early and reorganizing the house's domestic arrangements in ways that Evelyn found infuriating and secretly useful. Charles wore his good coat, which had been cleaned and was now genuinely rather than nostalgically good-looking, and he stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who has decided something and is at peace with the decision, which was perhaps the most content expression she had ever seen on him, and she walked down the aisle toward him with her father's watch in her pocket for comfort, and thought that 5 years ago she had been afraid of this exact thing and had made herself wrong about it. The ceremony was short and honest. The words exchanged were the traditional ones, and they were meant completely by both parties, and the Reverend, who was a sensible man, kept the sermon brief and the blessing sincere. When it was over and she was Mrs. Talbot by the law and the church and her own complete willingness, she stood in the May sunshine outside the church with her hand in Charles's and thought about the last 8 months, and about the letter that had hit the floor of the mercantile, and about the note under the floorboard, and about riding to Miles City with 31 head of cattle in October cold. And she thought that if Daniel had told her about the loan and she had simply paid it, and it had all gone smoothly and routinely, she would not be standing here. And the thought was complicated, and she chose not to fully unpack it in the sunshine with the Reverend pumping Charles's hand and Mrs. Garrett directing the general celebration with the precision of a military campaign. They received their guests and ate Mrs. Garrett's pie and drank the modest champagne that someone had obtained from somewhere, and in the late afternoon they drove home along the creek road with the valley golden around them and the mountains still carrying their late snow. The house felt different now. It had been feeling different for several months, since Charles had moved his things from the barn loft to the spare room in February after a cold snap that had been severe enough to be the practical excuse she had needed for what she had already decided. But it felt different again now in the way that official things are different from the thing they ratify. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where 4 people had once eaten, and where she had eaten alone with a book propped against the salt shaker. And now there were 2 people and no book, and the evening light was coming through the window the same as always, and everything was entirely changed. He came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and his chin on the top of her head, which was a thing he had started doing and which she was no longer making any effort to maintain composure about. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. "Good," he said, in exactly Toby Marsh's tone, and she laughed. That first year of their marriage was a year of building, in both the practical and the internal sense. Charles knew animals and tracking, and the particular practical knowledge of a man who has lived in the mountains. And he brought these things to the ranch with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He rebuilt the north fence properly, the one she had patched 3 times with available materials and crossed her fingers about. He built a proper root cellar, which the ranch had never had, and which transformed the question of winter provisions from a source of annual anxiety to a simple matter of adequate storage. She taught him the accounting side of running the ranch, which was more complex than he had expected, and she was amused by the specific expression on his face when he realized how many moving parts she had been managing alone, an expression she had seen on other people's faces when they looked at something they had assumed was simple and discovered it was not. They worked well together. This was not a surprise to either of them, but it was a pleasure, the specific pleasure of competence meeting competence without the need for negotiation about territory. In the evenings, when the work was done, they read. She had more books than a ranch had any practical justification for, collected over years from the booksellers in Helena and Bozeman, and ordered by mail in quantities that had occasionally made the stagecoach driver look questioningly at her. And Charles, who had been reading from a single crate of books he kept at the mountain cabin for 5 years, and had therefore read each one multiple times, approached her shelves with the contained enthusiasm of a man who had been very patient about a shortage, and was now addressing it. She watched him read sometimes, from across the room where she had her own book, and thought about the mountain cabin and the crate of books and 5 winters of solitude, and felt something complicated and protective that she did not have an adequate word for, and eventually stopped trying to name. She wrote to aldermen in Bozeman in November of that first year about the question of whether they could file an additional claim on the eastern pasture, which had an access issue she wanted clarified. Alderman wrote back with his usual precision and also mentioned, with what seemed like genuine warmth in the formal prose, that he was very glad to hear that the matters from the previous year had resolved well. She wrote to her aunt twice a month, and her aunt wrote back with a consistency and detail that was its own form of love. Her aunt came at Christmas that first year and stayed for 3 weeks, and she and Charles arrived at an understanding that was not warm exactly but was deeply respectful, the mutual recognition of 2 people who each saw clearly what the other was and found it satisfactory. Harlan Voss, as it happened, left the valley the following spring. He had been buying properties to build a water control scheme that depended on owning all of the upstream rights, and when the Hawthorne Creek property did not come to him as planned, the scheme unraveled sufficiently that his financial backers reconsidered their position. Evelyn heard this from Mrs. Garrett in the spring of 1884 and felt a satisfaction that was not precisely charitable but was entirely human. In the spring of 1884, she also discovered that she was expecting a child, which she worked out from various indicators before she said anything to Charles. And when she told him, she watched his face do something she had not predicted, which was to go very quiet and very still for a long moment, and then to look at her with an expression that had no defensiveness in it whatsoever, that was completely open in the way he had become capable of being open over the last year and a half. "You're certain?" he said. "I am," she said. He put his hands on her face very carefully and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Thank you," which was not the expected response and was entirely the right one. She laughed at him for saying thank you. He didn't mind. Their son was born in December of 1884, in the same bedroom where Evelyn's mother had died and her father had aged and Daniel had spent his last months. She thought about all of that during the long hours of it, and thought also about how a place accumulates its history and becomes layered with it, and how that was not a terrible thing. Charles had gone for the doctor from Coldwater Creek, with a speed and directness that had reportedly impressed the doctor considerably, and he waded through the process with a patience that was not entirely steady. Toby Marsh told her afterward, having stopped by to check on things, and found Charles sitting on the porch in December air with his hands clasped between his knees in an attitude of controlled tension. The baby was healthy and loud and immediately demanding in the way of all new people, and they named him Samuel, after Evelyn's father, which was Charles's suggestion, made quietly and without expectation, and which meant more to her than she expressed at the time and more than adequately later. Samuel Talbot was, from the beginning, a person with strong opinions about everything and the vocal capacity to express them, which Evelyn found exhausting and entirely understandable given his parentage. And Charles, who had expected a baby to be a version of other people's babies he had observed from a distance, found himself caught entirely off guard by the specific reality of this one. This particular small person who looked up at him with dark eyes that were already showing signs of being his own dark eyes, and who seemed, even from very early, to find his father's presence specifically interesting. Charles, for his part, took to fatherhood the way he took to most things, slowly and thoroughly, with great attention and no wasted motion. He learned Samuel the way he had learned the mountains, by patient observation and careful response, and he made, over the first year of it, the specific conversion from a man who had been alone for a long time to a man who was the center of a small world, and had discovered that this was what the solitude had been preparing him for. Evelyn watched this happen, and felt something she had no adequate word for, something that was related to gratitude and to love, and to the specific satisfaction of seeing someone you love become more fully themselves. In the spring of 1886, when Samuel was 16 months old and beginning to have very firm views about where he wanted to walk and what he wanted to touch, and when he wanted to be carried, Charles took Evelyn up the mountain for the first time since he'd come down. Not to the high pass, not to the distant winter place of 5 years' solitude, but to a meadow he knew partway up the eastern slope, reachable in a single morning's ride, where the aspens grew in a circle around a spring, and the view of the valley below was complete and clear. They left Samuel with Toby Marsh, who had developed a great fondness for the boy and whose opinion of babysitting as a concept had shifted substantially. They rode up in the morning light with the summer already warm at the lower elevation and the higher air still cool and clean, and Charles took her by a trail she would not have found without him, through timber and over a granite ledge, and along a creek that was barely a thread this late in the summer, and into the meadow that he had clearly been thinking about showing her for some time. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of place that rewards the effort of reaching it, not dramatic or severe but perfectly itself, the aspen circle, the spring, the grasses long and seeding in the July warmth, and below through the eastern gap the valley spread out in its full summer color, the creek line dark through the golden grass, the roof of the house catching light. She could see the house. Their house. Hers and her father's, and now theirs together. She stood in the meadow with Charles beside her and looked at the valley for a long time. "This is where you came," she said, "when you needed to think." "Sometimes," he said, "the pass was higher, but this was closer." "Closer to what?" He looked at the valley below. "To everything I'd left," he said. "When I needed to remember, it was still there." She understood that completely and differently than she might have before Samuel and the root cellar and the mended fence and all the months of evenings with books across from each other and morning coffee, and the particular inhabited quality of a house that has been fully lived in. She understood it as the thing loneliness does when it is not stupid about itself, when it knows exactly what it is lacking and maintains that knowledge clearly without pretending otherwise. "Did it help?" she said. "Coming here." "For a while," he said. Then the knowing it was there but not being in it was worse than not knowing. He paused. "That's when I decided I had to either go down or stay up permanently." "What made you decide to go down?" He looked at her with an expression that needed no elaboration. "My letter," she said. "Your letter gave me a reason," he said. "I've been waiting for one." She turned to him in the meadow with the aspens moving in the light summer wind in the valley below and said, "I'm glad I sent it." "So am I," he said. She stepped close to him, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood there in the meadow for a time that had no particular length, just the summer and the light and the valley below and the mountains above, and nothing requiring immediate resolution. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because this is the honest truth of lives in that country at that time. The winters were hard, the market prices were erratic. The territory's transition to statehood in 1889 brought its own complications and adjustments. And old Toby Marsh died in the winter of 1888 and left Evelyn a letter that was 2 sentences long and contained more actual affection than some people manage in a full-page correspondence. But the difficulties were of the manageable kind, the kind that people who are genuinely well-matched face together and solve together, and occasionally argue about in the specific honest way of people who argue, because they are engaged with each other, and not because they are afraid. They argued sometimes. About money sometimes, because Evelyn had learned not to carry debt silently, and was vigilant about it to a degree that Charles occasionally thought excessive, and she was willing to hear that perspective and dismissed it approximately half the time, and incorporated it the other half, which was a reasonable ratio. About the cattle operation, about the herd size and the timing of drives, where they both had experience and legitimate differences of opinion. About books, once memorably, about a novel that they had both read and which they disagreed about in ways that turned out to be interesting rather than divisive. They did not argue about what mattered. They had spent too long being indirect about what mattered to waste it once they had access to it. Samuel grew. He grew the way children grow in that country, with the specific combination of wildness and competence that the land produces in children who are raised to take it seriously. He could ride before he could read, which Evelyn corrected on the reading side with determination, and could read very well by 7, which Charles observed with a satisfaction that was entirely without vanity, because it was pride in someone else's accomplishment, and he had always been better at that than at accepting his own. In the autumn of 1889, when Samuel was 5 and Montana had just become a state in November, and the valley was adjusting to what statehood meant for things like land titles and water rights, and the various legal structures that had been territorial approximations, and were now required to be something more settled, Evelyn told Charles that they were going to have another child. He was in the barn when she told him, which was not where she had planned to tell him, but he was there and she knew, and she had already waited 3 days because she wanted to be certain, and 3 days was as long as she was willing to wait. He put down what he was working on, which was a harness buckle that had been giving him trouble, and he looked at her in the lantern light of the barn with Samuel's old pony watching over its stall door with the expression of philosophical indifference that ponies maintain about human affairs. "Another one," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then the smile came, the real one that she had first heard as a laugh in the common room of Mrs. Pryor's establishment, the one that transformed his face into something warm and open. "Good," he said. "You're saying good again," she said. "Like Toby." "Toby was usually right," Charles said. He picked up the harness buckle again. She watched him for a moment, this man in the lantern light of the barn she had built with her father, this husband and father and former mountain person who dried dishes without being asked and read books across from her in the evening, and had come down from the high pass in October of 1882 because she had needed him, and because he had been waiting for a reason, and because some things, if they are genuinely true, survive 5 years of mountains without losing their truth. "Charles," she said. "Yes." "I love you," she said. Not for the first time, they had been saying it for years, but each time she meant it as the specific present tense thing it was rather than an accumulated habit. He set the buckle down again and came to her in the lantern light and kissed her with the ease and warmth of a man who has had years of practice at this and has not found it repetitive. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew what to do about it." "You figured it out eventually," she said. "You helped," he said. Their daughter was born in June of 1890, in the same bedroom, with the same doctor, with Charles on the porch in the same attitude of controlled tension that had apparently become his established protocol. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, and for the simple reason that when they said the name, it felt right for the specific person who had arrived, and naming a person for someone they are is the best reason there is. Clara was different from Samuel in every way that mattered and complementary to him in every way that was useful. Where Samuel was direct and physical and inclined to express his opinions at volume, Clara was watchful and precise, and had a quality of stillness at a very young age that reminded Evelyn of Charles, and that Charles found apparently both familiar and alien. The strange experience of recognizing yourself in someone else without warning. The four of them, in the years that followed, made the kind of family that the valley had always deserved, but had not always had. The kind that keeps its commitments and maintains its fences and knows the names of its neighbors, and has opinions about the right way to do things, and is willing to be argued with about those opinions, and occasionally turns out to be wrong. Evelyn took in 2 students in the winter months of 1891 and 1892, children from homesteads too far out for the Coldwater Creek School, and discovered that she had not left teaching behind so much as deferred it, and that teaching in her own kitchen on winter afternoons with Clara on her lap and Samuel making grudging contributions from across the table was both less and more than teaching in Helena had been, and that the balance of more and less was exactly right. Charles rode the high pass one more time in the autumn of 1891 to close up the cabin he had left there properly, to retrieve the box of books and the few other things worth retrieving, and to do whatever internal accounting a person does with a chapter of their life before they close it fully. He was gone a week. She did not stand at the window and watch the pass while he was gone. She taught her students and managed the cattle and mended the harness, and waited with the specific patience of a person who knows with complete certainty that someone is coming back. He came back on a Thursday with the box of books on the pack horse and something quieter in his face that was not sadness but was the adjacent thing, the weight of completed things. He unpacked the books and put them on the shelf with hers, which was fuller now than ever, and stood back and looked at the combined library of their separate years and seemed satisfied. "All right," she said. "Better than all right," he said. She recognized her own words. She had the strong sense that he had been saving them for exactly this moment. She went to him and stood beside him in front of the books, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the evening light of the house her father had built, the house that had collected all of them now, the histories of everyone who had loved this land and this creek and this particular view of the mountains. And the house held it all with the equanimity that good houses develop over time. Outside, Samuel was somewhere along the creek with a fishing line, and the conviction that patience was a virtue other people needed to develop. Clara was asleep in her room with the window open to the June air. The mountains were purple in the late light. The creek was making its summer sound, low and consistent, the sound of water rights that were clearly and permanently theirs. Evelyn thought about a letter hitting a floor and a man on a mountain, and 4 words on brown paper, and a locked door that was now not merely unlocked but entirely off its hinges, and she thought that the story she would have told herself 5 years ago about what her life was going to look like was so impoverished compared to this that she could almost be grateful to Harlan Voss and his acquisition schemes for forcing the issue that she had been avoiding. Almost. She was not that charitable. Charles tightened his arm around her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That things turned out considerably better than they deserved to," she said. "Do you think so?" He looked at her. "I think they turned out exactly as they deserved to." "That's a different kind of accounting," she said. "It's the accurate kind," he said, with the certainty of a man who has had years of mountain solitude to think about what things deserve and what they don't and has arrived at clear conclusions. She leaned into him. The light changed as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the valley shifted into its blue evening color, and the creek went on speaking its permanent, practical language about persistence and water rights, and the value of knowing what is yours. Samuel came in from the creek empty-handed but unbothered about it, because he had his father's patience about some things even if not about all of them, and Clara woke from her nap and demanded company, with the directness that was entirely her own and probably always would be. And the evening assembled itself around them with the comfortable, unremarkable, entirely extraordinary quality of an evening in a house full of people who belonged to each other. The mountains stood in the dark above the valley. The high pass was up there, under the stars, the cabin closed and emptied and left to the seasons. The valley was here, lit and alive, the creek running along the property line in the dark, the water right clear as the stars. Charles Talbot had come down from the high pass in October of 1882 because Evelyn Hawthorne had asked him to, and because she had needed him, and because he had been in love with her for 5 years and had been waiting for a reason to stop pretending otherwise. He had stayed because the valley was what he had been thinking about for 5 years, and she was the center of it, and the practical circumstances had resolved, and the impractical ones had resolved alongside them, and there was nothing left to go back to and everything to stay for. He had been right about that. He had been right about most things, in the careful, patient, thoroughly considered way of a man who takes his time with decisions and does not make them carelessly. She had been right too. Eventually, after some significant delay that she no longer held against herself, because holding things against yourself is less useful than the alternatives, and she had better things to do with that energy than regret a locked door she had since taken off its hinges entirely. The story of it, the version she sometimes told Clara when Clara was older and asked how her parents had come to be married, was simple and accurate and left out the parts that were too interior to share. A man came down from the mountains because a woman needed help, and the help resolved the situation, and when the situation was resolved, they discovered that neither of them was in a hurry to end the arrangement. Clara would say, "But why did he come down?" And Evelyn would say, "Because she asked him to," and Clara would say, "But why would he do that?" And Evelyn would say, "Because sometimes when someone asks you the right question you find out you've been waiting for it." Clara would then say that this made no sense, which was perhaps fair, and Samuel, if he was present, would say that it was obvious, which was perhaps also fair, and Charles would say nothing but his expression would be the quiet, open, thoroughly settled one that had replaced the careful calibration of his mountain years, and Evelyn would look at him across whatever room they were in, and think that 5 years ago she had been wrong about what she needed and had found out the expensive way, and that the expense had been, in the final accounting, exactly worth it. The creek ran along the property line. The mountains stood above the valley. The deed was clear and the water rights were solid and the house was full, and the evening was easy, and everything that had needed to be resolved was resolved, and everything that had needed to be said had been said, eventually, in the kitchen and the common room and the mountain meadow and the barn, and all the other places where two people who are genuinely suited to each other find occasion to tell the truth. It was enough. It was, in the particular way of genuine things, exactly enough.